Today I want to share with you why you need to store whole grains in your prepper pantry. And then I want to share with you 3 ways to make flour at home using your whole grains. Hi sweet friends, I'm Mary and welcome to Mary's Nest, where I teach traditional cooking skills for making nutrient-dense foods like bone broth, ferment, sourdough, and more. So if you enjoy learning about those things, consider subscribing to my channel. And don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. In my previous Prepper Pantry videos, I spent a lot of time going over all the different types of dry goods that you can buy based on what you like to eat that you can then store in your Prepper Pantry, or what we also call the extended pantry. But today I really want to spend some time focusing on the importance of why you should be storing whole grain in your prepper pantry. Whole grain, when stored properly, has a very long shelf life. It can often be considered to be shelf stable for 8 to 10 years. And some people will even say it'll be shelf stable for 25 years, while others will consider it basically a forever food, and when stored properly, will stay fresh basically for forever. And this is a benefit because if you tried to store whole grain flour, where you just took your whole grain and ground it up in its whole grain form, and now had whole grain flour that had all the bran and the germ intact, it would only have a shelf life of maybe about 6 months. Some people may say a year. And the reason for the limited shelf life of whole grain flour is because it does have that bran and germ intact, and they contain oils, and those oils can go rancid. Now you may say, well, what about just storing plain all-purpose flour or bread flour that have had all the bran and germ sifted out of them? So basically now they're just white flours. Can I basically just store those indefinitely? And that is correct, that the bran and the germ have been removed. So now you have a less chance of spoilage because the bran and the germ, which contain the oil, yes, have been removed. The problem is, over time, flour, even in its white form, even if in its all-purpose or bread flour form, can become somewhat musty. It can become stale. It can take on off flavors or off odors. So even in that all-purpose or white flour form, it's really considered to only have a shelf life for maybe a year or 2. So having whole grain on hand is very beneficial because you can store it for an extended period of time, and then when you need flour, you can grind it fresh. And that can be very important, especially when we've been going through times like we have been now, where flour has often been very difficult to find. If you have your whole grains, then you can just grind them up and you'll have your flour. Now I want to talk about storing the grain properly, and I also want to talk about grinding it into flour and the different options that you have. There's something for everybody. Now I don't want you to worry about having the whole grain on hand, thinking that you're going to be very limited in terms of what type of flour that you're going to have. Because when you grind this, you can also sift it through a mesh strainer and sift out as much bran and germ as you want. And you can sift out almost all of it to the point where you basically have an all-purpose or a plain or white flour. That's the wonderful thing about having whole grains on hand, because you can grind them to whatever texture you want, and then you can sift them to whatever level of bran and germ that you want in them. So you can have 100% whole grain flour, or you can have something that's as close to all-purpose or plain flour that you can buy. And now, what type of whole grain do you want to store? This is where you have a lot of options. And what's especially nice for any people who are on a gluten-free diet, you can store gluten-free grains. Now, the type of grain that you decide that you want to buy, and you may want to have a variety of grains on hand, may really depend where you are on your journey from a processed foods kitchen to a traditional foods kitchen. Often the easiest type of whole grain to find are wheat berries. And yes, the whole grain is often referred to as a berry. I've seen at my local grocery store where they have the bin section, they'll often have bulk wheat berries for sale. And definitely at the specialty grocery stores like Whole Foods, there often are wheat berries for sale. And those basic wheat berries that you often see sold in bulk sections are hard red wheat berries. And that is usually what the typical whole wheat flour that you might buy at the store is made of. But there are lots of varieties of wheat berries that you can buy, which will often be sold more commonly at those more upscale grocery stores like Whole Foods and others. And there are lots of sources for whole grains online as well. And I'll be sure to put links in the description below to some of the places where I buy whole grains. You might see hard red wheat berries, which, as I said, are the most common. You might also see hard white wheat berries. And white wheat is also 100% whole grain, just like red wheat is. It's just a different variety. And it often has a slightly lighter color, and it often bakes up a slightly lighter baked good. You may also see the terminology soft wheat berries. And basically, soft wheat berries are wheat berries that are grown to have less protein, less gluten. And they often, when ground into flour, are what are used to make things like cakes and cookies and muffins. They bake up lighter baked goods. And a third terminology that you might see when wheat grain is being described is winter wheat or spring wheat. And really that just has to do with when it was grown, what season, temperature, weather, all these other different things. But it can get to the point where it just kind of boggles the mind, and you really don't need to worry about it unless you were a professional baker. But I think the most important thing to remember is that really all you need to focus on is whether you want to get hard wheat berries or soft wheat berries, or a combination for that matter. The hard wheat berries being very good for baking bread, and the soft wheat berries being very good for baking your cakes, cookies, pastries, so on and so forth. However, if you can't find soft wheat berries and you don't want to order them online, don't worry. Hard wheat berries, hard red wheat berries, if that's all you can find, really can come down to being your all-purpose flour. You can grind your hard wheat berries or your hard red wheat berries, if that's the only variety that you can find, to a texture that can be very coarse or can be very fine. And then you can sift out bran and germ to create the level of density you want in your flour. So there's a lot that you can do if all you can find are hard red wheat berries. They're going to work great. Now, outside of the realm of the modern day wheat berries, whether you get the hard red wheat or the hard white wheat or soft wheat berries, whatever the case may be, there are other grains you can purchase as well. There's rye, and there's kamut, which is an ancient grain. There's einkorn, which is an ancient grain. There's spelt, which is an ancient grain. There's a big variety. And if you're farther along on your traditional foods journey and you really want to be baking with ancient grains that are known to be richer in vitamins and minerals, you can certainly store those types of grains as well, the actual whole grain, the whole einkorn grain, the whole spelt grain, whatever you want. You can even store things like whole buckwheat, whole corn, dried corn that you can grind into cornmeal, or buckwheat that you can dry into buckwheat flour. You can also store whole oat groats. And this is not the old-fashioned flaked oatmeal, it's the actual whole oat groat. And then you can grind your oat groats and make oat flour. And when you buy your oat groats, especially if you are worried about gluten, you can make sure that those oats, which are naturally gluten-free, haven't in any way been contaminated by other crops around them. And so you can look for oat groats that are 100% guaranteed to be gluten-free, that they've not been contaminated with gluten. So there's a whole host of grains you can store in their natural whole grain form that'll have a long shelf life and will be ready for you whenever you want to turn those into flour. And the nice thing about having whole grains is that they also serve as a food. You can cook these whole grains the same way you would cook rice. And I have a video, which I'll link in the description and in the iCards above, where I show you how to take oat groats and turn them into oatmeal. And you can cook up spelt, you can cook up einkorn, you can cook up any of these grains and serve them as a side dish, a savory side dish, the way you would serve rice. Now let's talk about storing our whole grain for the long haul. Now, I like to store my whole grain in 5-gallon buckets with gamma lids. These are the ones that just screw off very easily, but you also use the snap-on lids. And I have a video where I go into a lot of detail about how to put the gamma lid on, put the ring on, so then you can use the screw top part of the lid, and how you should store your food in these buckets. It's very detailed, and I'll be sure to link to that in the description below and in the iCards. Unless I run out of space, though, I'll put everything in the description below. And the other option is you can also store your grain in Mylar bags like this, the whole grain, not the whole grain flour, the whole grain. And that will stay very fresh as well. And I have a video where I go over all about Mylar bags, what you can store in them, and how to seal them. And then I have a third video where I go over the details between using silica gel packs, which help control moisture, versus oxygen absorbers, which help control, obviously, oxygen, the damage that oxygen can cause. And that's be very helpful whether you want to store it in your 5-gallon bucket or in your Mylar bag. I go over all the details in that video as to what are the most appropriate options, whether you should use a silica gel pack or an oxygen absorber. But just briefly, I'll explain that if you were to fill this bucket full with whole grain and you wanted to keep it as fresh as possible and you decided to put oxygen absorbers in here, then you would not want to use this bucket as your regular bucket where you were taking out grain and opening the bucket periodically, because that would reduce the efficacy of your oxygen absorbers. Instead, if you think you're going to be accessing this grain on a regular basis, then you could do a couple of different things. Now, this is supposed to be airtight and very safe in terms of protecting your grain from insects and other possible problems with rodents and whatnot. However, that said, nothing is 100% foolproof, which I go over in the video where I talk about storage units. But to try to deter bugs, you can put some bay leaves in with your grain. Now, if you want to kill bugs, then you're probably going to want to mix in diatomaceous earth. Now, I'm not a huge fan of using diatomaceous earth, but people swear by it, and it definitely will kill any bugs. And so if you do decide to mix in diatomaceous earth with your grain, as you do that, you would put maybe a little diatomaceous earth down on the bottom, and then put some grain, then some more diatomaceous earth, and then some grain. Maybe roll your bucket around a little to get the diatomaceous earth very well distributed throughout your bucket. And I would recommend that you wear a mask and goggles, because diatomaceous earth is very powdery, almost like working with baby powder. And we're told on the packaging you want to be very careful not to breathe it in because it can be a little caustic to your esophagus and your lungs. However, scientists say that mixed in with the grain and then eventually if you go to ingest a little bit of it, it's safe. But I'm not a huge fan of using it. I just find it kind of messy and awkward. And so I'll just go ahead and put the bay leaves in and hope for the best that at least I'm deterring bugs. And some folks will also recommend that you freeze your grain if you have room in your freezer for anywhere. Some people say 7 days, some people say 14 days, it really varies. But if you freeze your grain, it supposedly is supposed to kill off any eggs that may be here that could hatch later, and then you have your grain infested with bugs, which obviously would be a problem. But if you want to do that and then store it for the long term, you just want to make sure that after you take your grain out of the freezer that you let it dry thoroughly, especially if you're going to be using an oxygen absorber in your bucket, because anything that you store with an oxygen absorber has to be 10% or less in terms of its moisture content. And the same is true with your Mylar bags. If you're using an oxygen absorber in here, which is what you would be using with your Mylar bag, you want to make sure that whatever you put in here, for example, in this case, our whole grain, that you make sure that if you have frozen this, that it's dried completely before you go ahead and store it. But the nice thing about using Mylar bags is that these, as you'll see, are very tight. There's like not a lot of room or oxygen in here once you put your oxygen absorber in. And so even if there were eggs that could potentially hatch, they'd really be deprived of oxygen. And then as you take out your grain, you could always sift them out. Now, something you do want to keep in mind when storing whole grain in Mylar bags is that these are not rodent-proof. So you would want to store them in some type of other container if you feel that there is a threat that they could be around rodents. So you could put them in a 5-gallon bucket like this. You could put them in a very heavyweight, like a Rubbermaid type, one of those big plastic containers, and just line them all up in there. There are various options that for you to store these. But what's most important is that you need to know that this packaging is not rodent-proof. Now, is anything 100% rodent-proof? I don't know, other than maybe some big, heavy, thick metal box. But, people have said that rodents have been able to chew through these 5-gallon buckets as well as those big plastic containers. So that is always something to keep in mind, that there's not a perfect solution. But at least this will help in deterring rodents, as opposed to this just on its own would not. And now for an extra level of freshness when storing your grain in a 5-gallon bucket, if you think you're going to store it for the long term and you're going to be putting oxygen absorbers in here, you could always line your bucket with a Mylar bag. These come in all different sizes. And then you could fill your grain in there, and then you could put in your oxygen absorbers, seal your Mylar bag, and then put your screw top lid on, or your snap-on lid, whichever one you're using. And the nice thing actually about using these small Mylar bags is that if you think you may not be using a lot of grain on a regular basis, and you're thinking, gee, I may not go through 5 gallons of grain very quickly, and so I'd rather not always be opening my storage container, exposing my oxygen absorbers to the oxygen and decreasing their efficacy, exposing my grain to oxygen, so on and so forth. You can store them in these bags, put them in your bucket or in your plastic container, and every time you think you need about this much grain, you can just pull out a bag and you're all set. Now, if you open the description under this video, I'll have a link to the blog post that'll correspond with this video, where there'll be a lot of links where you can go for various resources to learn more about storage containers and how to store things properly, as well as what are the expected shelf lives of these things. As I said, different sources have different opinions on this, but I'll be sure to have those links, and you'll find that the Utah State University Extension Service is a wonderful authority on this, as well as the Latter-day Saints organization. Although they are a religious organization, they are considered experts on how to store food long term. So I'll definitely have links to their sites over on my website, and so you can read more about how to do all of this very properly so that you will extend the shelf life. And I also extend the shelf life of your grain. And I'll also be sure to put that link to the videos that I talked about earlier, where I show you how to store, where I show you all the different types of storage options that are available for storing food long term. And one thing I want to mention for storing grain in a 5-gallon bucket like this, and in a bucket where you're accessing your grain on a regular basis. So you're not putting in an oxygen absorber because you're opening this, every other day or weekly, whatever the case may be. And this is basically the bucket that you're using on a regular basis. Something that chances are you're not keeping in your prepper pantry, your extended pantry, but something that you're keeping in your working pantry because you're accessing it regularly. And what I've done in that case, as I mentioned earlier, is that with my grain, I'll just put in some bay leaves. I might put some on the bottom and then put in my grain halfway up, put some in the middle, and then maybe put some bay leaves on top. just to deter bugs from wanting to enter into my grain bucket and have a little feast on my grain. But people will often say, well, do the bay leaves impart any kind of flavor onto your whole grain that then would be transferred when you grind that grain into flour? And I have not found that to be the case. And I gather others have also not found that to be the case. Even people who grind flour and will store it in a 5-gallon bucket like this because they're using a lot. They're using a lot of flour. So they'll grind a lot, put it in their bucket, put in some bay leaves, and they find that it deters the bugs and it doesn't take on the bay leaf scent or flavor. So that's something to keep in mind. And I've found storing my grain, this one is where I keep my spelt whole grain, which is what I have here. And I have some bay leaves on the bottom and on the top, and I've never found that it has interfered or transferred any aroma. No, and definitely no taste once I grind the flour. Now let's talk about the 3 options we have available to us when it comes to taking our whole grain and grinding it into flour. Now on to part 2, where we're going to talk about how to grind our grain into flour. Now, one thing I want to mention before we start talking about grinding our grain into flour, if you've not had a chance to download my 36-page pantry list, be sure to open the description underneath this video and click on that link. It's totally free and it'll list for you everything you need for your traditional foods pantry, your working pantry, your fridge, your freezer, and your extended pantry where we often talk about storing whole grain. Now, when it comes to grinding grain, I know 3 ways to do this. But after we go through these 3 ways, if there are other ways that you know of, be sure to leave that in the comments below so that we can all learn from each other. Now, the first way that I know of how to grind grain into flour is by using an electric grain mill. Now, there are all sorts of electric grain mills, and they run the gamut of price as well. I really like the Mock Mill, and I just have the Mock Mill 100. This is the smaller Mock Mill. But it's stone grounds grain, which is great, and it's made in Germany. It's very well made. I'm very pleased with it. And if the Mock Mill is something that you're interested in, I have a video where I do an unboxing of this one when I bought it. And I'll be sure to link to that in the iCards and in the description below. And if you ever decide you want to buy one, be sure to open the description under this video because I have a discount coupon code, which helps to make this nice and affordable. Now, I've got my grain mill set on 5. The Mock Mill goes from 1 to 10. And I find for the most part, I like to grind my grain just on a medium grind. This way, I feel it makes a nice all-purpose whole grain flour. But you can certainly grind your grain to be very fine or to be very coarse. Most grain mills will give you some options when it comes to grinding your grain. Now, most grain mills that use the stone grinding process do work at keeping the grain somewhat cool and preventing the oils in the bran and the germ from going rancid. But if you're really worried about that, you can definitely put your grain in the freezer and let it get nice and chilled before you grind it. Now we'll go ahead and grind this grain. I've got 2 cups of whole spelt berries here, and then we'll talk about sifting it if you want to sift out some of the bran and the germ to create a lighter flour than a 100% whole grain flour. So here we go. And now in less than a minute, we have this beautifully ground spelt flour. And if you've never ground your own flour, you're going to love this because the aroma of freshly ground flour is just fantastic. Now, if you want to go ahead and bake with this, in my case, this would be 100% whole grain spelt flour. You can definitely do that. But if you decide that you want to sift out some of the bran and the germ, which was not an uncommon process, even going back to the Middle Ages and before, so that when you go to bake with this, you're baking with flour that's a little bit lighter, which will help make your loaf a little bit lighter and more palatable. And this may be exceptionally helpful if you're on the beginning of your traditional foods journey and you're just starting to introduce whole grain breads and baked goods into your and your family's diet. Now, if you just want to use a typical household mesh strainer, if this is all you have, you can definitely use that. If, however, you want to be able to really sift your flour very fine, almost to the point where you're making it an all-purpose flour, where you've pretty much sifted out most of the bran and the germ, you can do that with finer sifters. And these are pretty much available at most, baking stores or like kitchen stores that sell baking supplies, and they're often numbered. They'll be like a number 50 or a number 40 or a number 30, and they will allow you, they're very fine, so they allow you to sift out a lot of the bran and the germ, and the more that you want to sift out, the finer the sifter you'll want to use. However, that said, and I'll be sure to put links in the description below if you want to find these, but I think you might be able to find them on Amazon. I'll look, but I know Breadtopia carries them, and so do some of the other kitchen stores, whether in person or online. But if all you have is a mesh strainer, I'm going to show you that you can get a good amount of the bran and the germ sifted out, and we'll go ahead and do that right now. All you want to do is just pour your freshly ground flour, your whole grain flour, into your fine mesh strainer, and then just start to sprinkle it out into your bowl, and then I'll show you what remains. And once you sift your flour through your mesh strainer, just your regular household mesh strainer, you'll be left behind with some of the bran and the germ. Now you've got flour that's a little bit lighter and will bake up a lighter baked good. Now I put the sifted bran and germ back into my flour, and I'm just going to put that back into this bowl. And now I'm going to use one of these more finer strainers. And these are very reasonable. These are not expensive. So if you want to get to the point where you're being able to sift out more bran and germ and make even lighter bread so that or other baked goods, so that you have something closer to an all-purpose flour, these can be very handy. So I'm just going to go ahead and put that down into my bowl. And then I'm going to dump my flour in here. And we'll start sifting this, and I'll show you the difference in terms of how much bran and germ you can sift out of this. Now, this one that I'm using is slightly less, a slightly less finer mesh than the smaller one. So this won't take out all the bran and germ, but it'll take out a good amount. I have to be honest with you, between the 50, the 40, and I think there, as I said, there's also a number 30, I don't find the difference significant, but definitely if you were just wanting to make an all-purpose flour, as close to what you might be able to buy at the grocery store, then you'll want to buy the most fine mesh strainer you can find. Now, as you'll see, with the real fine mesh strainers, you're going to sift out a lot more bran and germ, and you're going to get a much lighter flour. Now, when it comes to using whole grain flour, it's best used right after you grind it. But if that's not convenient for you, you can store it. It's going to stay freshest the longest if stored in your freezer, and then your refrigerator, and the least length of time it'll stay fresh is when it's stored at room temperature. But generally, depending on what way you decide to store your whole grain flour, your freshly milled whole grain flour, it's really going to range anywhere to stay fresh from 6 months to 1 year. But I really think that you should err on the safe side and try to use it up within 6 months. Because I think as you push forward more to 1 year, it may start to take on some off odors. There may be some rancidity developing in the oils, in the bran and the germ. Now I've got another 2 cups of whole grain spelt here, which we're going to grind into flour again. But before we get started doing that, I just want to mention that you may be wondering how much flour you get from a 1 cup of whole grain. It does vary, but generally you're going to get about 1.5 cups, maybe 2 cups, but generally 1.5 cups of flour once you grind your whole grain, your 1 cup of whole grain. So by grinding these 2 cups of whole grain, we should get about 3 cups of flour. Now the next way to grind whole grain is to use some type of high-speed blender, like a Vitamix. Now my Vitamixer might look a little funny because it's very old. I have nothing to do with this company, but I bought my Vitamix back, I think maybe around 1990, and it is still going strong. Now, I gather with the modern Vitamixes, you can buy a separate canister that's specifically made for putting on the base of your Vitamix for grinding grain. But I've also read reviews where people have said that if you're just going to grind grain every now and again, you may not need to invest in that container. But if you're going to grind grain on a regular basis, then that container is well worth it. But if you have a Vitamix, or Vitamixer, I would definitely check with the company, look on their website, or if you had a manual that came with your Vitamixer to see if the basic canister that does come with your main, with the basic Vitamixer, if it is meant for being used to grind grain, because you wouldn't want to damage your Vitamixer container. Now, there's a wonderful video on YouTube, and I'll be sure to link to it below, where someone from the Vitamixer company demonstrates how to grind grain in a modern day Vitamixer. And I believe she is using the canister that's made for grinding grain. But basically what she recommends is to take your 2 cups of whole grain and just go ahead and dump it right down into your, I'm making a little bit of a mess here, and dump it right down into your container. And then she starts, now mine's a little different because it is older, but she starts on 1 and then works up to 10. For those of you who have the new Vitamixer, that may make sense what I'm saying. But she starts on 1, as I said, and works up to 10 and grinds her grain for 1 minute. Now, a tip that I want to share with you, I mentioned it briefly when we were talking about the electric grain mill, but a friend of mine has the modern Vitamix. And what she does is she definitely freezes her grain before she grinds it in her Vitamix. And she finds that if she has frozen her grain when she grinds it for 1 minute to turn it into flour, it still feels relatively cool, as opposed to if she just takes room temperature grain and grinds it, it feels a little on the warm side. So that is a tip that I want to share. I think it's not as important if you're using an electric grain mill. However, if you are grinding your grain in a Vitamixer, and I think that this may be something that is possible to do with other high-speed mixers, but I'm not 100% sure. You'll want to check with your manufacturer. I just, because I have the Vitamix, this is what I've learned. But that, I think, is definitely something that you want to keep in mind about maybe when you're using the blender method, to think about freezing your grain so that it's nice and cold when you start, since the blade that's grinding it is metal, that there's, you're not dealing with a grain mill and stone grinding it. So what I'm going to do, as I said in her video, she starts on 1, works up to 10, and then grinds the grain for 1 minute. So what I'm going to do, mine just has low, medium, and high. I'm just going to start on low and see how we go, and I'll work up over the course of that minute if I feel that on low it's not strong enough. Well, I grinded this for 1 minute and I kept it on the low setting for the entire time because it seemed to be doing very well. I've always felt that this particular model of Vitamixer is very powerful, and so I think that on low it's done a really nice job. I'm going to put it out into this bowl and show it to you so you can see it. And I started with very cool grain, and I have to say that overall the grain still feels, it's not necessarily cool, but it's not hot. It feels more like if you were just touching a room temperature flour. And as you can see, this has ground the spelt berries into a lovely flour. This is very similar, in my opinion, to the number 5 on the mock mill. So I would imagine that if you want this to be finer and you have the modern day Vitamixer, On high for 1 minute may give you a very fine flour, since I did low on mine for 1 minute. And as I said in the video from the Mock Mill Company on YouTube, she starts at 1, but she goes up to 10, which I'm assuming is the same as high. But this is a lovely, I find on the low for 1 minute, it's not too hot. The flour, as I said, is not hot, and it's a lovely grind. And then this, as I said, very similar to the number 5 on the Mock Mill. And then if you wanted, you could go ahead and sift out some bran and germ to whatever extent you wanted to remove that to make an even lighter flour. Okay, I'm back. I had to get this out of storage. Now, the third way to grind grain is to use a manual grain grinder. And this takes a little energy. Now, this is what I used to use before I bought my Mock Mill electric grain mill. But this is very handy, and I keep this in storage because if for any reason we were in a situation where we had an extended period without power, this would be perfect for grinding my grain, and then I could use my sun oven, which we'll talk about another day, to bake bread. Now, we'll talk about all the prices in a minute, but a manual grain grinder like this, and this is the Wonder Mill that you'll often see sold by Lehman's, and the cost of this and the cost of the electric Mock Mill grain grinder, the Mock Mill 100, the smaller one, they're basically about the same price. So it's really a matter of whether you want to have something that can be, always handy and can be used regardless of whether or not you have electricity, or if you want something that's a little easier to use but does require electricity. Now, just like with the Mock Mill, I also have a discount coupon code for Lehman's. So if this is something you're interested in, be sure to open the description below and look for those discount codes. But there's also a link to my website that'll take you over to my shopping guide. And I'm always updating that with more and more new discount coupon codes. So be sure to check that as well. Now, as you'll see, we'll talk about mounting this and all and how this works. As you'll see, this just has a handle on it right now. And that's basically how it comes. But you can also buy a flywheel attachment. And the flywheel basically replaces this handle. And you just attach it right onto your grain mill. And it looks like a steering wheel, and it's a lot easier to turn. And if you have a lot of kids, it's a very smart investment to make to add to your manual grain mill, because they really like spinning it. And I have a girlfriend, she's got a bunch of kids, and she's got it mounted right on the counter in her kitchen. And whenever the kids are in there, she tells them, okay, whenever you go by the grain mill, give that flywheel a spin. And they give it more than one spin because they find it so much fun. And then she's got all her flour ground. Now, you've got a couple of options for how you would mount this. You can mount this directly. It's got 4 holes here, and you can mount this directly with heavy bolts onto some type of wooden, heavy wooden table or heavy wooden base. If you know my friend Heidi over at Rain Country Homestead, she has a manual grain mill. I don't know if it's the Wonder Mill, it may or may not be, but it's the same concept in terms of mounting it. And her husband mounted it to a very heavy-duty table. And so she's always got it ready, to grind her grain. But Wonder Mill also includes this bracket, so that if you don't want to mount this somewhere permanently, you can use this bracket. And basically what this is it has 4 screws across the top here, and they correspond with the 4 screw holes on the bottom of the Wonder Mill. And then what you do is you take the Wonder Mill and you remove these screws, and you basically mount this on top of the bracket, and then you put the screws back in, and then it's just sitting on top of this bracket. Then you find a secure place to mount this. I was not able to ever mount this on my kitchen island. You have to find a place where you can mount it on your counter or on your table. Now, depending on if you have a kitchen island, depending on what thickness your island is, you may be able to mount it onto that, but mine was a little too thick. But definitely it works for counters, and like if you have a nice heavy kitchen table. And then you just put this right into whatever you're going to mount it on, your counter or your table, and then you tighten these bolts on the bottom. And you just tighten both of them evenly until this is really tight and secure on your counter or your table. Now, the nice thing about this manual grain mill, the Wonder Mill, is that it does come with stones. So you're going to be stone grinding your grain, and that's always preferable. As we talked about before, when you stone grind grains, you really do the least damage to the bran and the germ, thereby preventing the rancidity of the oils that are contained in the bran and the germ. Now, in addition to the stone grinders, this Wonder Mill also came with steel grinders. And that's generally how I see it sold. I believe you can buy it just with the stone grinders, but the one that I've seen at Lehman's is generally the one which I have that I purchased there, has comes with both the stone grinders and the steel grinders. And the steel grinders are very good if you're grinding oily, really oily things like nuts, or you want to make nut butters and things like that. Now, if you're looking for this online and you just want the stone grinders, stone grinding burrs, I believe is the proper terminology, then I believe it's just referred to as the Wonder Mill Junior. If you want it with the stone grinding burrs and the steel grinding burrs, I think then they call it Wonder Mill Junior Deluxe. And that's what I have. That's what I found at Lehman's. I've not seen the one, at least not at on their website, with just the stone grinders. But that is something to keep in mind. If you just want the stone grinding burrs, be sure to look for that online, and you may be able to find it. And I have to be honest with you, I'm not 100% sure why they call this the Wonder Mill Junior, unless they have a manual grain grinder that comes in a larger size. I know that they do sell something that they just refer to as the Wonder Mill, and that's an electric grain grinder, different in style than the mock mill, but along the same concept of that it requires electricity to grind the grain. Now, I'm just going to put a bowl under here, and I'm going to go ahead and put some of my whole spelt berries into the little hopper here. And then I'm going to just hold the base. Oops, I'm making a mess again. I'm just going to hold the base and grind the grain so that you can see exactly what's involved in this process. Now, speaking of grinding the grain, this knob here in the front moves, and you have to adjust this to what tightness that you like in terms of how you want your grain to come out. Do you want it to come just cracked? Do you want a coarse grain? Do you want a medium grain, a fine grain, so on and so forth? And it's really just a matter of playing with this knob and testing it out a few times as you grind your grain to see exactly what you like. And also, too, the manual gives you a little tip that you really still want to be able to move this. You don't want it to be too difficult for you to move. And that will also help you gauge in terms of, do you have a good setting for grinding your grain. If it's really difficult to move, then you want to loosen it slightly. And the looser you make it, the coarser the grind of your grain, and the tighter that you make it, the finer ground flour you'll get. Now I'm going to show you the grinding process that would be involved if you were actually grinding this into flour. This is going to come out very coarse. You'll see almost a whole grain or maybe a little bit of cracked grain, because without it actually mounted, and my having just one hand to do this, it is more difficult. But I just want to show you the basic process of what's involved. So here we go. So that's basically what you do. But once this is mounted, it's not going to be moving around, and you can use both hands, or you'll have the flywheel, and it'll be a lot easier to grind your grain. But I just wanted you to see what the basic process is, and your flour would start to come out here. Now I just wanted to go over the cost of these different type of grain mills. And the Wonder Mill that we just talked about, as I said, this is the Wonder Mill Junior Deluxe, so it comes with both sets of burrs, the stone ground burrs and the steel burrs. And this at Lehman's is $259. And it comes with this bracket as well and a brush to clean it. And so, you know, it comes with a few little accessories like that. And if you open the description below, I have a coupon code where you can get $20 off, so that would come down to $239.95. But the actual retail price is $259.95. Now the Mock Mill 100, and this is the smaller Mock Mill. They do make a Mock Mill 200, but I find that this grinds grain very quickly. I know some of you have asked me, oh, if you have a big family, should you get the bigger grain grinder? It's really just going to be a matter of how many minutes. It really comes down to how many minutes, you know, you want to spend grinding grain. But as you see, you know, we did 2 cups pretty quickly. And so I'm very happy with this. And so I said, this is the Mock Mill 100, and this retails for $279. And I have a 5% discount coupon below, which will take off about $14, which would bring it down to $265. So as you see, these are kind of close. They're not that far off in price. So it's really just a matter of what you think is going to fit your household the best. Now, Vitamix, you know, I bought mine 30 years ago. And I think it was even a refurbished model. I can't remember exactly, but it was nowhere near the prices that the Vitamixes are today. I know they can be pretty costly, but my husband recently saw a brand new Vitamix at, I think it was Costco, and I think he said it was about $299. Now I know Vitamix run the gamut. They can be $299, and I've seen them sometimes in catalogs that'll come to the house, you know, $499, $599. You know, I think it really depends on how strong the motor is. And if you're going to be grinding grain a lot, it is recommended that you get the dry grain canister to replace the blender type canister that it comes with, and you know, just traditionally in the box. And that I saw online when I was surprised. It was $149. So even if you got the Vitamix for $299 and that dry grain canister can fit that particular model, that's another $149. So what is that, almost $450? It adds up. But again, you know, yes, the Vitamix does a lot of things. So it can be sort of a one-stop shop appliance in essence. Now, if you'd like more information about the Prepper Pantry, be sure to click on this video over here, where I have a playlist that talks about how to stock your Prepper Pantry, what are forever foods, how best to store foods in your Prepper Pantry, and lots more. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country kitchen. Love and God bless.